Jimmy Williams, 72, had lived in the same Queens brownstone for over 4 decades, a place where every creak in the floorboards carried the weight of his family's history. Life with his wife, Margaret, had been steady and warm. Sunday walks through Flushing Meadows, quiet evenings over tea, and mornings spent reading the paper at the kitchen table while she hummed old songs. He had always believed they were a team, bound together by years of routines and shared memories. But over the last few months, little changes had started to nag at him, small enough to dismiss at first, but too consistent to ignore. Margaret had begun keeping her phone close, tucked into the pocket of her cardigan, even when she went to fetch the mail. Before, she'd leave it on the counter for hours, never caring who saw it. One afternoon, when Jimmy joked about her joining some secret spy club, she smiled thinly and said she was just getting more calls from friends at church. A week later, she added a password lock, something she'd never bothered with in 34 years of marriage. Jimmy told himself not to overthink it, but it planted a seed of unease. Soon after, she started taking calls on the balcony or in the bedroom. Her voice hushed. Once, as he walked past the half-closed door, he caught fragments. Phrases like, "almost ready," and "starting fresh soon." His stomach tightened, though he couldn't piece together what she meant. The distance between them grew in other ways, too. Conversations that once flowed easily now stalled. When he brought up plans for their upcoming anniversary, she brushed him off with, "We'll see." Then one Tuesday morning over tea, Margaret mentioned something that set his pulse racing. She suggested they gather all their account details, passwords, and important papers just in case of an emergency. The request sounded reasonable enough, but the timing and her careful, almost rehearsed tone made him uneasy. They had never managed their finances this way. Jimmy had his accounts, she had hers, and it worked fine. That night, unable to sleep, he logged into their joint account. The pattern was clear: small withdrawals over the last month, amounts that didn't match groceries, bills, or anything routine. Jimmy sat in the dim glow of the computer screen, his jaw tight. He thought of confronting her, but decided against it. If he was wrong, it could break what trust remained. If he was right, he needed to be prepared. The next day, he called Walter, an old friend from his days working in the city, now a retired lawyer in Brooklyn. Jimmy explained just enough to get advice without sounding paranoid. Walter's response was measured but firm. "If you have doubts, protect yourself now. It's easier to secure what's yours than fight for it later." Jimmy hung up, staring out the window at the quiet street below, the autumn leaves tumbling over the pavement. A plan was forming in his mind, one he never thought he'd need against the woman he'd spent his life with. But the way things were shifting, he couldn't ignore the signs any longer. The following morning, Jimmy rose earlier than usual, the city outside still muted under the gray November sky. He dressed with quiet purpose, pulling on his thick wool coat and scarf before slipping out the door. The chill of the early air bit at his cheeks as he made his way down the block to catch the bus into Manhattan. He had decided to act quickly before whatever storm he sensed truly broke. The bus ride was slow, every stop punctuated by the hiss of the doors and the shuffle of half-awake commuters, but Jimmy barely noticed. His mind was fixed on the conversation with Walter, on the image of Margaret whispering on the balcony, and on those unexplained bank withdrawals. By the time he reached the stately facade of his bank near Midtown, he'd rehearsed his story. A simple restructuring of his affairs for estate planning purposes. Inside, the warmth was immediate, mingled with the faint scent of polished wood and coffee. He greeted the branch manager, a man named Robert who had known Jimmy for years, and they settled into a private office. The words came easily. He wanted to move the majority of his assets into a trust under his son Michael's name, just to simplify things. Robert didn't question it, only nodded and began drafting the paperwork. Jimmy transferred his savings, his investment accounts, and even the deed to the brownstone. Enough remained in the joint account to keep up appearances, but the rest was locked down in a legally airtight, irrevocable trust. He felt both guilty and relieved as he signed each page, the pen scratching softly against the paper. When he left the bank, the wind had picked up, rattling the bare branches along the avenue, and Jimmy pulled his coat tighter, feeling the weight of what he'd done. That evening, Margaret seemed in unusually high spirits. She chatted about a new luncheon group at the church, asked about his day, even hummed while she cooked dinner. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of calculation, maybe, that kept Jimmy from relaxing. She didn't mention the finances again, and that silence only deepened his suspicion. 2 weeks passed without incident. Then, on a quiet Friday evening, after they'd finished dinner and the dishes were drying in the rack, Margaret turned off the television and sat opposite him at the dining table. "We need to talk," she said in a voice that was calm but heavy with intent. Jimmy's heart sank, but he kept his expression neutral. "I think we should get a divorce," she continued, her tone as composed as if she were suggesting they try a new restaurant. She spoke about needing space, about wanting to find herself again, about feeling she'd lost her identity in the marriage. Standard lines, Jimmy thought, ones he'd heard others repeat over the years, but they felt rehearsed, as though she had been coached. Then she added a sting. "I've made sacrifices for you, Jimmy, and I deserve more than this." The words landed like a stone in his gut, not because he believed them, but because he recognized them as part of a narrative being built against him. She mentioned a friend who had been helping her see things more clearly, though she didn't name them. Jimmy didn't need to press for details. He already suspected someone was guiding her. He nodded slowly and said, "If that's how you feel, then we should talk about next steps." The lack of argument seemed to unsettle her, but he wasn't interested in debating. He had already fortified his position. When the divorce papers arrived the following Monday, the demands were staggering. Half the house, half his savings, the bulk of his assets, the car, and a monthly spousal support payment. Jimmy read through the list slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line. The tone was aggressive, strategic, not the work of someone acting on raw emotion, but of someone who had mapped this out carefully, step by step. He closed the folder, set it on his desk, and stared at the fading daylight through the window. Whatever friendship or affection they'd once shared had been replaced by maneuvering and leverage. But Margaret didn't know the truth. She didn't know that everything she thought she could take had already been placed beyond her reach. And as the quiet of the brownstone closed in around him, Jimmy felt the first stirrings of calm since this had begun. He was ready for whatever came next, not because he wanted this fight, but because he had prepared for it better than she could possibly imagine. Jimmy had never been one for snooping or digging through other people's lives, but now, sitting alone at the small oak desk in his study, he knew that understanding who or what was influencing Margaret was the key to seeing the whole picture. The brownstone was quiet, except for the distant hum of the radiator and the faint traffic noise from the street below. The November wind rattled the window panes as Jimmy powered on the old laptop he kept for checking email and managing his bills. Margaret wasn't the most private person online, at least not until recently, and she still kept a public Facebook page mostly to post photos from church bake sales, neighborhood gatherings, and family dinners. Jimmy began scrolling through her recent activity, not entirely sure what he was looking for, until a name kept popping up like a stubborn weed. Jake. A man in his 40s with neatly cropped hair and a self-assured smile, Jake seemed to like nearly everything Margaret posted. His comments stood out even more. Phrases like, "You've got this," or "New beginnings are beautiful," sometimes accompanied by vague, inspirational quotes. At first, it could have been harmless, but Jimmy's instincts told him otherwise. Clicking on Jake's profile revealed more. He was a marketing consultant based in Manhattan, posting polished images of rooftop views, expensive coffee, and motivational slogans. Jimmy scrolled further until one particular photo stopped him cold. Jake standing outside a coffee shop in the East Village, the exact one Jimmy had passed months earlier when he'd spotted Margaret pacing outside, speaking into her phone in that low, tense tone. The timestamp matched the date perfectly. The coincidence was too neat to be ignored. Jimmy leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It wasn't proof of an affair or even direct wrongdoing, but it connected dots that had been floating apart in his mind. Margaret hadn't been pulling away because of vague marital dissatisfaction. Someone was actively feeding her ideas, and Jake fit the role too well. Still, Jimmy needed more than a gut feeling. He thought of Evelyn, one of Margaret's oldest friends from church, a woman who'd known them both for decades. The next afternoon, he called her under the pretense of catching up. For the first few minutes, the conversation was warm and easy, filled with pleasantries and small talk about neighborhood events. But when Jimmy casually asked if Margaret had mentioned anyone new she was spending time with, Evelyn's tone shifted ever so slightly. She hesitated, then said she didn't know anything, changing the subject almost immediately. It was the kind of quick deflection that told Jimmy she knew more than she was willing to say. He let it go, thanked her for her time, and ended the call, his suspicion deepening. That night, as he sat reading in the living room, the phone rang again. This time it was Paul, another mutual acquaintance. His voice was low and cautious. "Jimmy, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I think you deserve to know. Margaret's been spending time with a guy named Jake. From what I've heard, he's been advising her on the divorce. Telling her how to secure her future. That's the phrase someone used." Jimmy listened silently, the pieces falling into place. It wasn't just that Margaret had grown distant. She was being coached, step by step, on how to dismantle the life they'd built together and walk away with as much as she could. The following Saturday, Jimmy decided he needed to see it with his own eyes. He took the subway to Margaret's new apartment building in Astoria and parked himself at a diner a block away where he could keep an unobstructed view of her front door. The hours passed slowly, the steam from his endless cups of coffee curling in front of his face as the afternoon faded toward evening. Finally, he saw her emerge, bundled in her gray coat, and beside her was Jake. They weren't holding hands, but their closeness was unmistakable. The way they leaned toward each other, speaking quietly as they walked to his car. Jimmy's chest tightened, but he stayed put, not following them. He didn't need to trail them to know the truth. Margaret wasn't simply moving on. She was orchestrating a departure that would leave him stripped of everything. And Jake was right there beside her, helping her lay the groundwork. When Jimmy returned to the brownstone that night, the quiet felt heavier than usual. He sat in the study, staring at the wall, letting the reality sink in. Anger bubbled somewhere beneath the surface, but more than that, there was a deep, bone-weary disappointment. He had shared decades with Margaret, trusted her, built a life in good faith, and now realized she had been plotting an exit strategy behind his back with the help of another man. Still, Jimmy reminded himself that he had already made his countermove. The assets were secure, the house was protected, and the financial fortress he'd built over those cold November days was now his shield. The divorce mediation date arrived sooner than expected. On the morning of the meeting, Jimmy dressed carefully in a charcoal suit, the one he wore for important occasions, and met his attorney downtown. The mediation room was sleek and impersonal, with glass walls and a long, polished table. Margaret sat across from him, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. Her lawyer began reading through a list of demands. Half the house, half the savings, full access to his investments, the car, and monthly spousal support. Jimmy kept his gaze steady, saying nothing, until his attorney slid a folder across the table. "Before we continue," his lawyer said evenly, "you should review these." Margaret's lawyer flipped through the documents, and with each page, his confidence seemed to drain away. The transfers were all there. The trust documents in Michael's name, notarized signatures, and dates showing the assets had been moved 2 weeks before the divorce filing. The trust was irrevocable, airtight, and untouchable. "You didn't tell me about this," Margaret's lawyer said flatly, glancing at her. She snatched the papers from his hands, her face flushing as she scanned them. "You planned this," she hissed at Jimmy, her voice low but laced with fury. Jimmy simply replied, "I planned to protect myself." There was nothing her side could do. The law was clear, and the timing was on his side. The mediation ended without resolution, but both sides knew the momentum had shifted. As they left the building, Margaret caught up to him in the hallway, her eyes flashing. "This isn't over," she said through clenched teeth. Jimmy paused, meeting her gaze evenly. "The only thing I regret is trusting you," he said, before walking away into the cold city air. Over the next several days, the calls started. At first, Margaret's voice was almost gentle on the voicemails, pleading, saying they could work things out, that things had gotten messy but could be fixed. When Jimmy didn't respond, her tone turned sharp and accusatory, blaming him for everything wrong in her life. Then came the rumors. Friends told him Margaret was saying the divorce had been a test or a misunderstanding. The story didn't hold up, especially after one of their mutual friends came forward with screenshots of text messages between Margaret and Jake. In them, she talked openly about getting everything and starting fresh once the money's in, with Jake encouraging her to make him feel guilty if needed. The texts spread quickly among their circle, dismantling her narrative. People who had once taken her side began to distance themselves, and even her closest allies started going quiet. Jake vanished from her social media entirely. Jimmy didn't gloat, but he felt a certain quiet satisfaction. She had underestimated him, believing she could take apart his life without resistance. But he'd been one step ahead, and now the truth had a way of speaking for itself. The brownstone felt warmer, safer. The fight wasn't completely over, but Jimmy knew the hardest part was behind him. The rest would play out exactly as it should, and he was ready for it. The weeks following the mediation were a strange mix of calm and turbulence for Jimmy. Outwardly, life in the Queen's brownstone returned to its quiet rhythm. Morning walks to the corner deli for a bagel and coffee, afternoons reading by the window, evenings with the radio low in the background. But beneath the surface, the storm with Margaret was far from over. She had gone into what Jimmy could only describe as meltdown mode after learning she couldn't touch his assets. The calls came daily, sometimes 5 or 6 in a row. The first few were almost tender, her voice thick with regret, telling him she had made a mistake, that they could reset and move forward. "Jimmy, we've been together too long to let it end like this," she said in one voicemail, her tone pleading. But when his silence persisted, the sweetness curdled into rage. The next message was a tirade, accusing him of being cold, cruel, and selfish, of ruining everything out of spite. Jimmy didn't respond to any of them. His attorney had made it clear, no contact outside of legal channels. And Jimmy wasn't about to break his own wall of defense. When the phone calls didn't work, Margaret changed tactics. She began weaving a story for mutual friends and family, telling them that the divorce had been a test to see how strong their marriage was, or that it had been blown out of proportion by miscommunication. Some even heard her say it was all a joke that had gone too far. The problem for her was that the story didn't hold water for long. Friends started asking questions she couldn't answer. Why had she hired a lawyer? Why were there formal demands for property, savings, and support payments if it was just a joke? Still, she doubled down, insisting Jimmy had misunderstood her intentions. Jimmy let her dig her own hole, confident that truth has a way of seeping through cracks, no matter how hard someone tries to plaster over them. The breakthrough came unexpectedly one chilly Thursday afternoon. Jimmy was sorting through the mail when his phone buzzed with a message from Matt, a man he knew mostly through neighborhood gatherings. They weren't close friends, but there was mutual respect between them. "Got something you should see," the message read. Curious, Jimmy called him. They agreed to meet at a small diner not far from Matt's office in Long Island City. When Jimmy arrived, Matt was already in a booth, nursing a cup of coffee, his expression grim. Without much preamble, Matt slid his phone across the table. On the screen were screenshots of text messages between Margaret and Jake. Jimmy's eyes scanned the words, each line tightening the knot in his stomach. The messages were damning. Margaret wasn't just venting about the divorce, she was strategizing. "Once the settlement's done, we'll have everything we need," she had written. Jake's response was worse. "Don't back down. Make him feel guilty if you have to. He owes you. We'll start fresh once you've got the money." Another from Margaret read, "He's suspicious. I think he's catching on." Jake replied, "Then keep it light. Don't push too hard until the papers are signed." Jimmy scrolled slowly, his mind flashing back to every odd look, every clipped answer, every time she'd shifted a conversation away from the future they once spoke about, openly. "How did you even get these?" Jimmy asked finally, looking up at Matt. Matt explained that a mutual acquaintance of his and Jake's had overheard some of their conversations and realized what was happening. This acquaintance, uncomfortable with the scheme, had taken screenshots from Jake's own phone and passed them to Matt, knowing he had some connection to Jimmy. I couldn't just keep them to myself, Matt said. You don't deserve this. Jimmy thanked him sincerely, his gratitude clear in the firm handshake he gave before leaving the diner. By the next week, the screenshots had quietly made their way through their shared social circles. Friends who had once been sympathetic to Margaret stopped returning her calls. Invitations to gatherings that once included her ceased. Even her brother, who had previously scolded Jimmy for being too extreme, called to apologize. I didn't know what she was doing to you, he admitted, his voice subdued. I just took her word for it. I was wrong. Meanwhile, Jake all but disappeared. His online presence dropped off, and Margaret stopped mentioning him to anyone. Jimmy suspected Jake had seen the writing on the wall and decided to cut his losses before her situation dragged him down too. Without Jake's influence, Margaret's confidence seemed to falter. Her voicemails changed tone again. Less venom, more desperation. You don't have to forgive me, but can we just settle this and move on? I'll drop everything if you just talk to me, one message pleaded. Jimmy didn't answer. He knew any conversation would only give her a foothold to start climbing back into his life, and he wasn't willing to risk it. The legal process moved steadily toward finalization. With her leverage gone and her legal team unable to challenge the trust or the transfers, Margaret's demands crumbled. What had started as a calculated strike to claim half of everything ended with her walking away with only her personal belongings and whatever savings she had in her own name. Jimmy didn't celebrate. There was no joy in dismantling decades of marriage, but there was relief, a quiet, steady sense of safety returning to his life. One afternoon, not long before the final papers were signed, Jimmy took a slow walk through Flushing Meadows Park, the bare winter trees etched against the pale sky. The air was sharp, the kind that made every breath feel clean. He passed the Unisphere, its steel arcs glinting faintly in the low sun, and thought about how close he had come to losing not just his home and savings, but the peace of mind he'd worked his whole life to earn. He thought about Walter's early advice, about the hours at the bank moving his assets, about the bitter sting of realizing that the woman he'd shared his life with could plan against him so deliberately. And he thought about the calls he no longer answered, the stories she could no longer spin, and the quiet truth that now sat firmly on his side. When the divorce was officially finalized, the brownstone felt different. Not empty, but reclaimed. Jimmy's son Michael came over with a few gallons of paint and helped him refresh the living room. They moved some furniture around, replaced a few old pictures with new ones, and even fixed the shelves that had been sagging for years. Feels more like you now, Michael said, stepping back to admire their work. Jimmy nodded, the faintest smile crossing his face. He knew Margaret would likely keep trying in small ways. An occasional card, a text at Christmas. But the fortress was built, and his boundaries were firm. As winter deepened and the first snow fell over the city, Jimmy settled into his new routine. Mornings at the diner, afternoons in the park or at the library, evenings with a book and the soft hum of the heater. The weight that had pressed on him for months had lifted, replaced by something steadier. The knowledge that he had not only survived the storm, but had done so without losing himself in it. In his mind, the matter was closed. Margaret was no longer part of his story, and whatever chapter she was writing now was hers alone to face. For Jimmy, the rest of the pages were his, and this time he intended to fill them on his own terms. The first few weeks after the divorce papers were signed felt like a long exhale Jimmy hadn't realized he'd been holding. The air in the brownstone was lighter, the rooms quieter in a way that felt peaceful rather than empty. The constant edge of anticipation, waiting for the next sharp remark, the next quiet maneuver, was gone. He woke up to sunlight spilling across the bedroom floor, brewed his coffee without rushing, and sat by the kitchen window watching the city begin its day. Outside, Queens moved at its usual pace. Delivery trucks rumbling down the street, neighbors hurrying to the subway, the smell of fresh bagels drifting from the deli at the corner. Inside, Jimmy felt something he hadn't in months: ownership of his own life. There were no more voicemails from Margaret swinging between regret and rage, no more sudden confrontations or sideways questions about money. She had faded into the background, and the only trace of her was the occasional mention from someone in the neighborhood who hadn't heard the full story yet. Even those conversations were brief. Most people had seen the texts between her and Jake by now, and sympathy for her had dried up. Still, Jimmy wasn't naive enough to think the aftermath would be entirely clean. A few times, a plain white envelope appeared in his mailbox with no return address, notes in Margaret's handwriting, short and carefully worded. "I hope you're doing well," one read. "I'm sorry for everything. Please call me." Another said, "You know we had good years. We can't just erase them." Jimmy never responded. The trust and history they'd once shared were gone, replaced by a reality he couldn't pretend away. Forgiving her might someday be possible, but letting her back into his life wasn't. He had learned the hard way that some doors, once closed, have to stay shut. His days slowly reshaped themselves. In the mornings, he took longer walks, sometimes heading to Flushing Meadows Park to watch the early joggers circle the paths or to sit near the Unisphere and sip coffee from a paper cup. The cold didn't bother him much. It felt bracing, like a reminder that he was still here, still moving forward. Afternoons were spent in quieter pursuits, reading in the library, visiting Michael to help with small projects around his apartment in Brooklyn, or working on the kind of home repairs he used to put off. He even started volunteering twice a week at the community center, teaching basic carpentry skills to a group of teenagers. It gave him a sense of purpose, something tangible to offer beyond his own survival story. Margaret, from what he heard through the grapevine, wasn't doing as well. The circle of friends who had once nodded along with her version of events now kept their distance. Jake had disappeared entirely. No one had seen him at her side since the fallout from the leaked messages. Without him as her shadow, the energy behind her plans had evaporated. Jimmy didn't take satisfaction in her struggles, but neither did he feel responsible for them. She had made her choices, just as he had made his, and the consequences were simply the natural result. Every so often, someone would suggest he meet with her just to talk things out, but Jimmy always shook his head. "Talking got us here," he would say. "I'm not going back." One snowy evening in January, Jimmy sat by the living room window, watching flakes drift past the street lamp, coating the sidewalks in soft white. The city's usual noise was muffled, as if the snow had pulled a blanket over everything. He thought about the year behind him. The quiet suspicions that had started it all, the sick feeling of realizing the woman he trusted was planning against him, the cold calculations he'd been forced to make to keep his life intact. There had been moments when he'd doubted himself, when he'd wondered if he was being paranoid, if maybe he should let things slide. But looking around now, at his home still in his name, at the peace he'd fought for, he knew he'd done the right thing. Waiting would have cost him everything. Acting when he did had saved it. His son Michael visited often, sometimes bringing his own friends, filling the house with voices and laughter again. On one visit, they worked together to finish repainting the kitchen. When they were done, Michael stood back, admiring their work. "Looks good in here," he said, "like it's yours again." Jimmy smiled faintly. "It always was," he replied. "I just had to remind myself." That was the truth. He hadn't built his life for it to be handed over without a fight. The betrayal had hurt deeply, but it had also clarified something for him. He valued his independence and his peace above all else, and he was willing to defend them, even against someone he once loved. The calls eventually stopped. The envelope stopped coming too. Whether Margaret had given up or simply run out of words, Jimmy didn't know, and he didn't much care. Life kept moving, and he found himself paying more attention to small pleasures. The way the late afternoon sun painted the buildings gold, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the block, the sound of a saxophone echoing from the subway station. These were the details that filled his days now, steady and unremarkable to anyone else. But to him, they were signs of a life rebuilt on his own terms. As spring approached, Jimmy began planning a small trip upstate to visit an old friend he hadn't seen in years. The idea of leaving the city for a few days excited him in a way it hadn't in a long time. The brownstone would be here when he got back. Safe, quiet, his. Before everything had happened, he might have worried about what could go wrong while he was away, but now he felt secure. The trust was in place, the legal battles were over, and the people who mattered to him knew the truth. He had weathered the worst, and it had left him standing. On the morning he booked the trip, Jimmy poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and stepped out onto the stoop, the city already awake around him. Delivery bikes zipped past, a bus hissed to a stop at the corner, and somewhere nearby a radio played an old jazz tune. He thought about the long path from suspicion to action to resolution, and how every hard choice along the way had led to this moment. Margaret was no longer a presence in his life. Jake was a name that barely registered anymore, and the battles they'd brought to his door were behind him. There was no triumph in it, just a steady, enduring peace. And for Jimmy, that was more than enough. The chapter with Margaret was closed, the pages sealed. Whatever came next, he would face it on his own terms, in his own home, in his own city. And as he took that first sip of coffee, the steam curling into the crisp morning air, Jimmy knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.